Last month I had the privilege of speaking for Mother's Day, and we talked about some of the mothers in the Bible and the examples that they gave. And so I thought I'd cheat a little bit and just do the same thing for Father's Day as well this week. So it's going to be a little bit similar, but instead of talking about moms, we're going to be talking about dads. And again, like we all have stories about our moms, we also have them about our dads as well. So I thought we could share some fun stories that I found. One story was, my father died when I was 16, but this story still cracks me up whenever I think about it. When our cat died, Dad buried her under a tree in the backyard. A few nights later, Mom went into the garden and found that the dog had dug out Taffy and eaten up one of its legs. She woke up Dad in the middle of the night, so he went out in PJs and army boots with a shovel over his shoulder and redug the hole. But because it was late, he decided to get rid of the towel he'd originally wrapped Taffy in and chucked it aside. He then reburied the cat and went back into bed. The next morning, Mom discovered that he'd chucked the cat aside and buried the towel. Another fun story was my favorite trips home from college. My favorite trips home were my trips home from college. As I was getting ready to leave, my mom would slip me some cash and tell me not to tell Dad. And then Dad would pull me aside and slip me some cash and tell me not to tell Mom. So I didn't tell either one of them. Another one, my dad and I got some pretty sweet gas-powered, remote-controlled cars for Christmas. I was 13 at the time, and I mentioned to my father, Dad, it would be really awesome if we took some wood and made a ramp off the back of the truck. My father responded, let's wait until your mother's gone to work. Fast forward 20 minutes, Mom's gone off to work, and we've set up the holy mother of all RC ramps off the back of the truck, and we're launching these RC cars over the house. We both found it hilarious until I messed up and didn't hit the jump fast enough, and instead of going over the house, I sent it through the window. My dad looked at his watch and said, guess what, kid? You're going to learn how to replace a window today before your mom gets home. And then last month I shared a story about a memory with my mom. And I have to say, every time I share a story about my parents or my life growing up, I always get in trouble because I don't say it right. And so I had to call and double check with my mom and my dad this time to make sure that I got this story right. But when I was in 8th grade, my dad got really sick. He ended up with pneumonia, and he was in the hospital for about a month. Pretty close. And before he went to the hospital, he was home, he was sick, he was sleeping in another room away from my mom, he was so sick. And I just remember, I was not present, but I heard about it later and thought it was hilarious because my dad was not a very big Star Wars fan. He tolerated it because my brother and I enjoyed watching it. So it was usually a good nap for him when we sat down and watched them. But he didn't like those, and so all of a sudden he wakes my mom up in the middle of the night. She's asleep in their bed, and he goes up to her and is like, do you know who I am? And he's got a towel over his head, and my mom's like, yeah? And he goes, I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi. And so my mom checks his forehead because it's like, what are you doing talking Star Wars here? He had 103 fever, and so it was like, all right, it's time to take you to the hospital if you're making Star Wars jokes. And again, just like our mothers, fathers play a big role in our lives in one way or another. They are there in the good moments and the bad ones. They have a unique way of parenting, and we have a lot of different examples that we can observe from the Bible. Today, actually, I was struggling to pick the dads that I wanted to talk about today because there's a lot of them. And unfortunately, when you look at some of the dads in the Bible, you see a lot more examples of what not to do. And I have a feeling that this is because, like some of the dads in these stories, we make some questionable decisions when moms aren't around. And when we're not on the same page there. I know there's times where I make decisions with me and my boys that I probably wouldn't make if Katie was around. But when we're on the same page, that is when we are best. And so today I want to share 6 fathers from scriptures that have stuck out to me over the years. And so with these, some of them I'll have some passages, some of them I'm not. I'm just going to hit some highlights with them. And so the first one is Abraham. And here you can find him in the book of Genesis. He's in several chapters, and so he's a big prominent part of it. But he came from the land of Ur, the city of Ur, And when God told him and his entire family to pack up and move to a different land, he did. God promised him that he and his wife would have children, even though they were both older in age, and God also promised that his descendants would be numerous. When God called Abraham to leave his home, he was 75 at the time. And so again, I don't know if I would want to pack up a move like that if I were 75 and travel hundreds of miles, especially how they traveled back then. It wouldn't be like getting some people to hire and load up in a U-Haul and go. But he did it. And again, he didn't have any children with his wife, but God said, you're going to have children. God tested Abraham as well with his son Isaac. He asked him to sacrifice him, and we're going to read about that in Genesis chapter 22. Just a real quick glimpse of Abraham. And chapter 22, verses 1 through 13 says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young man, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife so that they both went together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father, he said. Here I am, my son, he said. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Now, I always read this passage, and I always wonder, I'm like, you got to wonder what Isaac's thinking in some of this, because I don't think if my dad started tying me up, I would just sit there and take it. And there'd be some questions. I feel like I might, especially if he was 75 or older, I might try to overpower him a little bit and tie him up and be like, Dad, we need to have a conversation here. But they both had that faith, and they both were willing to follow through with it. And it says a lot about who Abraham was. Another father we can look at is Jacob. He was the son of Isaac and Rebekah, so he was Abraham's grandson, and his brother was a guy named Esau. One of the big things that we read early on in Jacob's story is that he stole his brother's birthright. He took it, he made a deal with his brother that I will give you this bowl of soup that you desire if you give me your inheritance, which Esau then did. And then later, when it was time to actually get it, Jacob's mom, Rebekah, and Jacob himself, they tricked their dad, his dying dad, Isaac, in order to get the birthright. But because of this, his brother it says he was a very good hunter in the Bible, and so probably a bit of a fighter, and so he was angry. And so Rebekah and Jacob made the plan that he fled and went and lived with his uncle Laban. And there he met Laban's daughter Rachel, and he fell in love with her. And he made the arrangement that he would work for Laban for 7 years, and then when the time was up, he would have Rachel as his wife. And so he worked for 7 years, and then when it came time to be married, he got Rachel's sister as his wife instead. And Laban went, well, we don't let the younger daughter get married before the older daughter. So you're marrying her, and if you want Rachel, you need to work for another 7 years. And so his uncle tricked him into basically 14 years of free labor there to marry one of the daughters, but he got 2 of them. And so that was, again, giving a picture of what his family looks like there. Another thing that Jacob did was he wrestled with God for a whole night. God came and he wrestled and he wouldn't let go. In the morning, he wouldn't let go until he was blessed by this man and by God. Eventually, Jacob returns home after being gone for probably about 20 or so years. And he came home and he was very much afraid of what his brother would do. His brother came and met him with 400 soldiers, but Esau embraced Jacob and they went home. And through the course of his life, Jacob had 12 sons that would be the founding fathers of the tribes of Israel. One of the famous stories that you have with Jacob and his sons would be about his son Joseph and the coat of many colors. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. He was a son of Rachel, the wife that he loved. And he got him a beautiful multicolored coat, and it eventually made Joseph's brothers get fed up with Joseph. And so they sold him into slavery, and they told Jacob that he'd been killed. And again, it was an interesting time as well. Read the story. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to these things. I told my dad who I was talking about, and he said, that's a lot more than I want to dig into. But we're going to do it. Like I said, I'm just hitting snapshots. But read their stories. Jacob is also in the book of Genesis. Two more dads I want to talk about. You don't really think about them. You talk about these guys as dads, but I want to talk about them today. They are the Eli and Samuel, the two priests that you read about in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, they both have pretty similar stories. Both men were priests. We don't know exactly how long Eli had been a priest, because when we meet him, he was an established priest. He was elderly, and he met Samuel's mother, Hannah, in the temple. We actually talked about Hannah at Mother's Day. It's the same mom there that we talked about. But she devoted Samuel, his life, to God if she could have a child, because she was unable to have it. And so God blessed her, gave her Samuel, and Samuel was there, lived at home for a little bit, but when he was old enough, he went and lived at Shiloh with Eli and his sons. And both men acted as judges for the people of Israel at the time. And so Eli was a big part of Samuel's life since Samuel was dedicated to the Lord and went and lived there. And a moment that you have between them is in 1 Samuel chapter 3. And it says this, starting in verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call you. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. And the Lord again called Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call you, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall speak, 'Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at the other time, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the two ears of everyone hears it will tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end, and I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." Samuel lay until morning. Then he opened the doors at the house of the house of the Lord. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." And he said, "Here I am." And Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. The way these are similar, as well as being priests and judges together, is they both had sons, and all their sons were corrupt, it says. We talked about. Later on, when you look at the time when Samuel was older and was about to die, it talks about the fact that Israel came to Samuel and went, we don't want your sons to be priests and rule over us as judges. We would rather have a king. And so you get the picture of what it would look like to have the earthly king, and the people said, we would rather that. And so it kind of goes to show where these guys failed a little bit as dads. The next dad I want to talk about is David. We find him in 1st, 2nd Samuel. Now, David's a pretty famous guy. He was anointed to be the second king of Israel when Saul had sinned and God had turned away from him and moved on to David. When it was talking about what God was looking for, he was looking for a man after his own heart. So something pretty that we all, I think, probably know is that David killed Goliath when he was a teenager, and the army of Israel was terrified. David went out with his sling, and he struck down Goliath with it, and with God's help. He and Saul had a very complex relationship. Saul was the current king of Israel, and David was the next anointed king, but Saul was still king at the time. And Saul had a very big complex. One of the things that Saul struggled with was it talked about like evil spirits would come and attack him and torment him. And the only thing that would calm him down was David coming and playing the harp for him. But that lasted only for a little while, and eventually he got very jealous of David, and he tried to kill him on multiple occasions. And David even had chances where he could have killed Saul, and he would have been just in doing it, but he chose not to. And he would show it, and Saul would repent, but he would go right back. And I don't know, I've never had this relationship with my father-in-law, but Saul was actually David's father-in-law. So to actually have your father-in-law trying to kill you out of fear and terror had to be a little bit of an issue at times when you get together. David wrote a large number of the Psalms when you read about him. Probably about 77 of the 150 were David. He had an affair with one of his friend's wife, Bathsheba, and then he tried to cover up what had happened. And when that didn't work, he eventually had Uriah killed in order to cover up the sin that he had committed. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it describes him as a man after God's heart. David was very successful as a leader in military and other things. At times he was a little bit prideful, and it talks about he counted the number of fighting men in the country, and because of that, about 70,000 people were killed because of his pride of trying to build up and look at what I've done. Later in his life, his son Absalom led a rebellion against David. A psalm that we can read about the mindset that David had during this time is Psalms 3, 1 through 3, where he writes, Lord, I have many enemies. Many people have turned against me. Many are saying about me, God won't rescue him. But Lord, you are my shield, my wonderful God who gives me courage. So again, even with all the mistakes, all the things he did, he was still trusting God. Another dad of looking at is a guy named Job. Now, again, snapshots because he has a really large book about his story. But here are some of the basics. Job was devoted to God, and Satan wanted to mess with Job, and most likely with God as well. And he wanted to get Job to curse God. So God allowed Satan to do whatever he wanted to Job as long as he did no harm to Job. So Satan took and killed his servants, took his livestock away, and killed his 10 children. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he killed them all. And Job kept getting like one report after another, bam, bam, bam. And his response was he ripped his clothes in mourning and prays to God and does not curse him. So later after this, Satan again tries to inflict more harm and says that, of course, he didn't curse God. Nothing actually happened to Job. He was untouched. So God tells him he can do whatever he wants to Job as long as he does not kill him. And so Satan goes at Job again and gives him skin boils. But yet again, he does not curse God. During this time, we see that his wife tells him to denounce God and die. A very supportive wife right there. There's a Christian comedian, Tim Hawkins, who talks about a joke of Job of like all these things get taken away from Job except his wife. And it's one of the demons asked Satan, like, why haven't you taken her away? He's like, I know what I'm doing. I don't know exactly how she is. We just see this short snippet. We don't know the entirety of their relationship. It's just one of those things you got to wonder. But again, she's struggling too because not only has it happened to Job, but it's happening to her as well. Her children have died. Everything she's knowing, people are leaving, and she is as well stuck with Job. And so it's got to be frustrating. And so also as well during this time, 3 of his best friends came and were trying to comfort him. They sat with him for 6 days and said nothing. I don't think I could sit silent for 6 days straight with a friend and not say anything. And on the 7th day, they started talking, and the counsel they gave him was not very good. They told him he must have done something to anger God, or he did something to cause this. So, and the Bible doesn't actually say for how long that this lasted with the skin boils. We know that it probably would have been at least a month or 2 at the least, and maybe under a year at the most. It doesn't ever say that this went on for years, but it talks about weeks and months. And so the duration of that time, that's where we got days and weeks, So it could have been a few months. It could have been just under a year. I don't think it was a full year, but we just don't know exactly for how long. And eventually, after a lot of prayer, God and Job have a moment. And after this, God intervened and ended Job's physical pain. And in return, he doubled his livestock from what he had before. And he gave him, again, 7 sons and 3 daughters. I always look at this story, and I got to wonder what Satan's thinking if God is so easily letting him test one of his followers to do this. To kind of wonder, like, this isn't really going to work the way I think it's going to. Because if God's going to let me do something, it's like, okay. But he lets it and it happens. Excuse me. Jumping ahead of my notes here. The last dad I want to talk to you about is Joseph. We find him in the Gospels. This is the Joseph who was Jesus' earthly father. In Matthew 1:18-21, it says, "Now the birth of Jesus took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." So Joseph helped raise Jesus, and we also know that later when King Herod ordered the death of the baby boys in Israel, that an angel appeared to him and told him to take Mary and the baby and flee to Egypt for a while, which they did. Not a whole lot else is actually talked about with Joseph. We know that he was a carpenter. Later on, when Jesus was in his ministry and he went to his hometown, the people said, "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" So we know he was a carpenter's profession. We know that he was present when Jesus got separated from Mary and Joseph in Jerusalem when he went and started teaching on the temple steps, and Joseph and Mary were returning home and they came back. He was there. His parents were there. But we don't hear about him later when Jesus' ministry begins. Again, like I mentioned before, it was pretty difficult picking these dads as looking through this. There's so many stories to share for these dads, and even picking some of them of what to share and what not to share. But for all of us today, I want to share some characteristics that these dads show us, and a couple warnings as well as we look through. And again, we didn't look through all of them, but some of the ones I want to focus on is the first characteristic would be their faith in God. Each one of these dads trusted in his leading. Again, Abraham trusted God and left the life he'd lived for 75 years just to go to an unknown situation hundreds of miles away. Jacob took a little more time to put his full faith in God. He did a lot of bargaining at first, but eventually he put his trust in God, and God changed his name to Israel. Eli and Samuel had great faith in God, and the people loved them and trusted their word because they proved to be godly men by their actions. David trusted God when he fought Goliath and was chased by Saul, and even when his own son was trying to kill him, he still trusted in God. Job never stopped believing in God, even when everything seemed to point to God turning his back on him, and he continued to believe in God. And Joseph's faith in God led him to help raise the Son of God. Another characteristic is the strength to follow God's instructions. Again, we talked about Abraham almost sacrificing his son. I don't think I could do that at all. I think a lot of dads would be in that similar situation. I don't know if you could actually do that. I don't think I could sit there and be knife over my son, be ready to stab him, to sacrifice him. I love my boys and I love God, but that's a lot. But the strength that Abraham had shows a lot of the kind of man in his faith that he was. Because it takes a lot of strength to be able to do that. At the end of Jacob's life, he packed up his family and took everything that he had and left to Egypt when God told him to. And this had to have been a very difficult choice when Jacob had already spent so much time away when he was younger from the land that was his. But he trusted that God knew what was best, and he followed. Eli and Samuel both followed God's instructions even when it was something that was difficult. Eli knew that God was going to punish him in his son's behavior, and yet he still continued to follow and minister. And again, Samuel, same thing of choosing a king, knowing what it would do and the consequences it would lead, still followed through and did what God asked of him. David in his life was by far not perfect, but every time he sinned afterwards, he would repent and pray for forgiveness and did his best to follow God's instructions for his life. Again, Job, after losing everything, when I read his story, I think the thing that hurt him the most, though, is losing his children. One of the things that his children would do is they would throw parties for a few days at a time. And when the party had ended, Job would wake up early in the morning and he would offer a burnt offering for each of his children in case they had sinned against God during that time. And even though he lost his children, his livestock, and his skin was inflicted with diseases upon him, he continued to follow God and what God wanted for his life. Joseph did not divorce Mary, but he married her when a lot of other men probably would have left her. And he trusted that it was actually God talking to him and that God knew what he was doing and was going to take care of him and his family no matter what was thrown at him. A couple of things that can be warnings for us and things that we need to remember as dads is we need to be leaders of our families, not followers. Abraham had been told by God that he was going to have a child. And since they were older and Sarah at the time could not conceive, she didn't think it was going to be her. So she took it upon herself to make it happen and had Abraham take her maid as his wife and give him a child that he was promised. Now, this wasn't the child that God had promised, though. They made this happen, and because of this, Abraham went along with it, and instead of if Abraham had just led instead of taking a back seat, this wouldn't have created the problem that came from these future generations of children fighting against each other. Because he had a child with the maid, and he had Isaac. But eventually, Sarah became jealous of the relationship he had with his oldest son, and they went away. God blessed Abraham's, the maid who became his wife, and also blessed his other son as well and took care of them. But again, it wasn't his plan. And Abraham here, instead of leading, just took a back seat and let others do things for him. If Eli and Samuel had led their children the way they led the people of Israel, maybe things would have turned out different for both of them. Eli's family could have possibly continued living. We know that his sons ended up going into a battle with some of the men of Israel, and they both died there. And Eli was given, a messenger came and ran back and told Eli, and he was sitting in a chair, and he fell back and he died because he was old. And again, it was just his line his family ended. And then when Samuel was getting older, and again, like I talked about, close to the age where he might die, the people said, your sons are corrupt, and we don't want to go through what we did with Eli's sons. And so we want to be like the other nations. We want an earthly king. And again, he gave a description of what it was going to be like, and it was not a pretty one, and they chose to have that over having Samuel's sons be their leaders. Another thing for us as dads that we need to remember is we need to love all of our children equally. Jacob is a very good example of this. By loving Joseph more than his other children, he created animosity between his sons, which led to the actions of his sons to sell Joseph into slavery and lie to their father for years about the fate of Joseph. After they did it and they told their dad was mourning and just felt miserable and was so much pain that they tried to go find Joseph, too many J names here today. They tried to find Joseph before it was too late, but it was too late. They couldn't find him. And then later on, when Joseph's younger brother was there, Benjamin, they were very protective of him because they knew that, it was Rachel's other son, the preferred wife, and they didn't want to hurt their dad again. And when you look at it, you got to wonder, if he hadn't have played favorites, what would Israel's history have looked like? You got to wonder, would they have ever actually gone to Egypt and lead to them becoming slaves? Would they have had to go back and conquer the land they were already living in because they'd been gone for generations after generations and so long? And again, some interesting what-if questions that all stem from Jacob playing favorites with his sons. And for dads today, it's one of the most important jobs in our world today. Where did it go? I have some statistics, but I forgot to print them. Okay. Some of the statistics that I looked at, it was from 2017 of when the father was absent from the home, was things like you were more likely to commit a crime if your dad wasn't in the house. You were more likely to struggle with obesity. The children, we're talking about the children. Children were more likely to struggle with obesity. Teen pregnancy was higher in houses without dads than with dads. There were several more, but that was in 2017. And if we look at statistics nowadays, I think it's going to be about the same or more. Dads are an important part, and it's talked about in the census there was about 19 million children in America, and 1 in 4 of them lived in a house without a father. So I don't know about you, but that seems like a problem. And I think it's a problem that we can overcome. But as a church, we need to become a better example for the world and for the fathers out there to see what a biblical father looks like. We need to learn from these biblical dads and apply the lessons to our lives. Earlier, as I was preparing today's message, I told my mom and dad, again, I mentioned before, but I told them what I was doing. I told them how there was a lot of options to choose from, and my mom quickly replied, that's because guys needed to hear something a lot more than women did. And she was kidding, of course, but I don't think she's necessarily far off on all of it. The only thing I would tweak is that we all, moms and dads, both of us, we need constant reminders, because being a parent is the hardest job there is, but it's also the most important job that's out there. So for dads today, I want to share one last thing with you. This was an open prayer to dads that was written in a Daily Bread back in 1989. I know I went a little ways back here, but the truth is what was written then is just as relevant today. And it says this: an open letter to family men. She was blonde and beautiful with azure eyes and a tumble of tawny curls. At 3 years of age, she would climb into her daddy's lap, snuggle up with a wide, satisfied smile, and purr. This is my safe place. And so it was. Dads, husbands, you are the safe place. You are our protector and provider. And when you gather us up for a time with God, we need a safe place. A safe place, not a lecture. A safe place, not a sermon. A very human dad, husband, who simply cares about God and us. We don't need or even want a spiritual giant. We just want you. And we need a gathering time, phone unplugged, where it is safe to say to each other, how are you and the Lord getting along? How can we pray today? We need a safe place to cry, laugh, sing, rejoice, challenge, share, and sometimes not to share and have it be okay. We need a time with you that's relaxed, unstiff, when we can pray honestly in simple sentences from our hearts. Unfixed, unrigid, unroutine, unshackled. We need a place where irregular options are respected and where God has the last word. We need a gentleman leader, not a general. Gracious, relaxed, human, a family shepherd who exhibits not infallible authority, but a thirst for God. Every day, not necessarily. Often, yes. Long, no. Where? Anywhere. How? Sense where we are at and zero in. We may need a heavy-duty confessing to each other and to God, or maybe silent prayer or exuberant praise. Try sing-along tapes. Again, I went back there, so. We could use Bible study, but not every time. Thanks for listening, Dad, husband, and remember, we need you, your family. So again, dads, we are needed. We need to lead our families. We need to love our families. We need to be safe places and encouragers to our families. And we need to be champions for God in our families. So the question is, will we answer this need? Will you pray with me, please?